Sugar Daddy Podcast, yo. Learn how to make them pockets grow. Financial freedom's where we go. Smart investments, money flow.
Hey, babe. What are we talking about today?
Today, we are going to have a really important conversation. I know we've talked about it on past episodes. We've talked about wills and trusts and probate and how to prepare for the inevitable, right? A little bit of an uncomfortable conversation, but it's one that we need to have, and we want to help inform our audience about why having a will and a trust and guardianship and conservatorship for our families, for our children, and why that's so important. And also why and how that helps preserve wealth within our communities. Because what we hear a lot is that, especially within the Black community, when we don't have proper documentation in place, that is how we lose our wealth. That is how we lose our assets. And so we're going to have a really incredible conversation today with an attorney, because we are not attorneys, but Nicola Rochester Robinson is. And so we are so excited to welcome her to the Sugar Daddy Podcast today. Nicola, thank you for being with us today.
My absolute pleasure.
We are so thrilled to have this conversation. So you have been in this field for quite some time. We're going to start off with your bio so that our audience can learn a little bit about you, but I don't want to waste any time. We have an important conversation to have today. We want to get into all of the details, pick your brain, use your expertise and your knowledge to help inform our audience. So let's get into this bio and kick it off. Nicola Rochester Robinson is the co-founder of the SR Law Group, an elder law and estate planning law firm in Douglasville, Georgia. Prior to starting the SR Law Group, she began her legal career as a trial attorney at Cozen O'Connor, where she worked most notably on litigation surrounding the events of September 11th, 2011. In 2009, she began helping friends with estate planning. A few years later, several members of her own family passed away, and she saw firsthand the importance of having properly drafted wills, trusts, and other end-of-life decision-making documents. It was through this work that she found her true passion for helping families understand the importance of estate planning and elder law. Nicola, a proud graduate of Emory University and Penn State Law, in her spare time, she enjoys hanging out with family and volunteering with her beloved sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Thank you, Nicola.
My pleasure.
Quick question.
So
Did you
excited
mean-
to be here.
Did you mean of 2001? September 11th, 2001?
Maybe, yeah. Is that
Feels right.
okay? Yep. No. Okay, we're just gonna skip right over that.
It's okay. What happens?
2001, September 11th, 2001. Well, you know, when I said it, I was like, 2011. That feels dated. I'm gonna go have a sip of this coffee, and we're gonna get right back into it. Nicola, we start all of our conversations with understanding people's first money memory, and then, seeing how that has impacted what they do now, their thoughts around money, feelings around money, how you interact with money. Obviously, wills, trusts, estate planning, all of that comes down ultimately to assets, to finances, to money. So what is your first money memory?
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay. The one that immediately came to mind when you asked the question was when I was a Girl Scout. So we're going to take this back to like 3rd or 4th grade. And I was a cookie seller. And this is back in the day when you could actually go door to door, knock on people's doors, sell cookies, when we thought it was safe. And I remember there was a time when I had collected all my money. I had knocked on everybody's door. Everybody placed their order and gave me the money. And then I got home and I had lost it. I dropped the envelope with all of the Girl Scout money. And I remember just like this complete feeling of dread, because my mom was also the Girl Scout was our Girl Scout troop leader. So I'm like, I can't go home. I can't tell my mama. I remember her like being on the phone with other parents about the money being due. Like it was just always high stress in our household around cookie season. So I remember like just sitting in the yard crying, just like, oh my God, I cannot believe I lost this money. And I was like, okay, like be smart about this, like retrace your steps. And it was fall, so it was leaves everywhere too. which is odd. But I remember looking down and there it was, the envelope with the money. And so being able to find it, like crisis averted. That was the first thought, like the minute you was asked about money memory.
Oh, do you have any remembrance of how much money was in that envelope?
No idea. But I just remember the feeling that I had about having lost it. Like, oh my God, like the panic, just sheer terror and panic.
Yeah, you knew the importance of actually keeping the money to place these orders. So, oh my gosh,
Absolutely.
I just got stressed for you.
I was a boy. I was a Cub Scout, so we didn't do. We weren't fortunate enough to have the cookies because we had popcorn, which really nobody wanted. So it really wasn't a big thing for the Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts.
We had a
And
previous
see, I
guest.
was top
Oh, go ahead.
I was top cookie seller, so I was always rolling in the dough. So I'm sure it had to be in like a decent amount of money.
Yeah, that's high stress at such a young age, but also kind of
Mhm.
helps you understand the importance of like, no, you don't want to lose this. Like, you need to hold on to it.
Yes,
Yeah, I love that.
absolutely.
Well, we are not here to talk about Girl Scout cookies. We are here to talk about something much more important, which is proper estate planning and making sure that proper documentation is in place. And I read that when your grandmother passed away, who was your favorite person, that there was land, and correct me if any of these details are wrong, but there was land left to your father and siblings, but it sounds like documentation was not the way it should have been, and so it caused a lot of tension. Can you talk to us about your experience with, what you saw during that time and how it impacted you?
Yes, absolutely. So my grandmother passed like 2010, I think. And her children, she had five children. My father was the oldest of her children, but he was not her biological child. He was her stepchild. But she was the only parent he really knew in terms of his mother. When his biological father and his stepmother divorced, he stayed with his stepmom. So again, that was who
Oh.
raised him. And then he had four siblings as well, who were his half siblings because they also shared the same father. When my grandmother passed, and we sat down after the funeral, and to hear my aunt say to my father, "Well, you're not her child. You don't get anything." Like I
Wow.
will never remember forget how that felt. This was the only grandmother I'd ever known. So if my father's not her child, wait, are you saying I'm not her grandchild? And that's really what it came down to. They felt like, well, you weren't biologically her child. There's nothing in place to, say anything otherwise. So you're not getting anything. My grandmother had inherited land from her parents. And it was kind of always just conversation in the family, like who would this land would be divided between the five of them. People even knew what parts of the land they would get. Like this was open conversation for years. One of my uncles, he had already even built his house on his. He was like, "Well, just I'll take my fifth right now, build a house for me and my family." And another uncle had started a house on his side. So it really was just my father and his two sisters who were like, "Okay, well, we need to divide up our portion." And they were just very adamant, like, "No, you're not entitled to any of this land." And so the hurt that came out of that, and I hate to tell you this, but the reality is it's what, 12 years later, that has never been repaired in our family. My grandmother was really the matriarch and the glue that bind us together. And after that conversation, our family has never been the same. Just the hurt that my dad experienced from that, and then to see those same siblings struggling with that land, not really doing anything with the land, and watching what my grandmother built deteriorate, because there was no plan in place, quite honestly, because there was no clear directions as to who was going to get what. So
That
yeah, that's kind of what was the springing board for my whole career.
that is heartbreaking.
Heartbreaking and unfortunately not uncommon.
Uncommon.
I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
when you start to see people's true colors, when money starts to get involved.
Well, that was going to be my question is up until that point, would you say that all the siblings had a good relationship? Was it, happy and holidays and you are my family? And then once the land came into question, then it was, wait a minute, pump the brakes? Or what was the dynamic before that?
Yeah, absolutely. When my grandma was alive, we all convened at her house. She was, the linchpin. All the five siblings plus their children all would get together. Never any conversation about these aren't my aunts, or these people aren't biologically related. I even remember, it's such a clear memory, at the funeral there were some strangers that sat behind me, but I could hear their conversation. And I remember them when my dad got up to say the eulogy, and they were like, well, that's her oldest. And the other woman was like, yeah, he moved away, but she loved her some Tony. My dad's name's Anthony. They're like, oh, she loved her some Tony. She talked about Tony all the time. So I could hear these strangers talking so affectionately at my grandmother's funeral about how my grandmother felt about my father, only for his siblings to then turn and say this. And so, yeah, we were great, tight knit until that day.
And that's what people, I think, that's the part that people need to remember, right? Is that everything can be fine and dandy when it's fine and dandy. But then when it comes to what did this person actually want? What were their wishes? And how do we actually execute on those wishes? If there's nothing in place, unfortunately, that's when people's, I hate to say it, true colors sometimes show up, And I think most of us have the mindset of, well, it's fine. Everything's fine. We get along great. My sibling would never do this to me. My so-and-so would never do this to me. But if it's not in writing, it all falls apart, right?
I mean, unfortunately, I've experienced, similar things in my family. When my grandfather passed away, and my grandmother was still alive, it wasn't as if both my grandparents were gone. My grandfather passed away, and we had, I had relatives asking, what am I going to get now? And I'm like, our grandmother's still alive. Like,
first off,
right.
First off, and then also she was in the early stages of Alzheimer. I was like, she gets everything. She's still alive, and she's going to need it to pay for the care. And even after she passed, eventually, there were some people asking, what am I going to get? And it's like, there's nothing left. I'm like, she was in full assisted care living, and my mom was the youngest of her three siblings. Unfortunately, her two other siblings have passed since then, but her being the youngest, she was actually the one that took care of everything because of she was the more responsible one and stuff of that nature. So I've seen it firsthand where I'm like, you like you said, you need to have whatever you want done. It needs to be in writing, legalized, and everything of that nature. Because, as you said, you can't just simply go off the word of, oh, we're on good terms, we'll take care of everything, it'll be fine. That's not what happens when the end comes. I mean, I can
tell you, I deal with tons of clients, and a lot of times I ask people about their children because it's part of our conversation. And they're like, oh, yeah, they're fine. They get along beautifully, da 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 da. And I'm just like, okay, did they share their toys when you left the room? Oh, no, they fought like cats and dogs. I said, you're going to leave the room. How are they going to act then? And that's sometimes the first time parents are like, ooh, yeah, my adult kids, ooh, like if we're really honest.
I love that.
That's a great analogy.
If they were not helpful as children.
Right. It's also very realistic, right? Like, our parents thankfully have everything in writing and in place. And, if they didn't.
Because I made them.
Well, that too. But if they didn't, me and my brother, for example, everything gets split down the middle, right? And there would be no question about that. But again, you don't want to leave it up to chance, right? Because people's relationships change and dynamics change. And, we both know that when that time comes for our parents, we will be taking care of the estate, right? We are the paperwork doers. We are the ones who are, in proximity closest.
I'm also a financial advisor. So.
Right. There's so many elements. So we know that we would be taking care of a lot of that, if not the most of it. And everything would still be split even if it wasn't in writing. But
I made my mom, I was like, my mom.
Well, I challenged that.
Oh,
you just said that If there, yeah, you said that even if it wasn't in writing, it would be 50-50 between me and my brother. Well, what I see a lot of times is there might be some unresolved issues that you don't even know your brother has. And so then brother says, well, mom loved me more or loved you more, and it's not fair. And
Well, it's,
so then he challenges that 50-50.
yeah,
We always mess
So
with your
we
mom.
have these assumptions that it's just like, oh, because that's the right thing, that makes sense, it should be down the middle. Or brother feels like he should be entitled to the whole thing.
yeah,
I know that seems unfathomable to you, but he may feel very strongly that it should be
right,
100% to him.
right. We always
So
joke.
don't we, and that's the problem. Most people just rely on the assumption that, oh, even if it's, not written down, it'll be fine.
Yeah, and you know what they say
Maybe
about
not.
assumptions. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
You're totally right. And even I could, if I was playing devil's advocate on both sides, I could easily then be like, you know what? I'm doing all this paperwork. I'm doing everything to settle the estate. I'm the one who did X, Y, and Z. I deserve
Yep.
70%, right? Like I could totally flip the script too. And so again, let's not leave it up to chance, right? And so
Exactly.
I think this is a perfect segue into, because there's so many elements in estate planning. So we're going to focus on a couple today. But can you just give us an overview of what is estate planning and why is it important?
Sure. So when we hear the word estate, there's even that word has just certain belief systems around it. Like we start thinking of the Vanderbilts or, the
The
Rockefellers or these
Rockefellers.
groups of people who we've known traditionally used to have a whole bunch of money. But honestly, your estate is everything you have. So whether that's your car, whether that's your bank accounts, even if it's just a few dollars in there, the house that you own, you don't have to have large estates. It's everything you own that is titled in your name that currently belongs to you. That is what makes up your estate. So even think life insurance policies, retirement accounts, all of those are all the things that we will need to have a plan for if something were to happen to you. That's really what estate planning is, putting that plan in place. So we have a clear understanding of not only what's going to happen to those things, but who's in charge, who's going to be the one to distribute those things to whoever it is that you have named as the beneficiary of those things. I like to think of estate planning as really twofold. We talk about the stuff, and that's where people start talking about wills and we start talking about trusts. But then there's a larger, often ignored portion of estate planning where we have to talk about planning for you, your person. There is a whole chapter of life called sickness. We might not get to your stuff for a number of years. We got to talk about dementia. We got to talk about if you're going to go into a nursing home or some type of facility, who is going to be in charge at that point? Where's the funds going to come from for that? So we do advanced healthcare directives, we do power of attorneys, we do documents that can facilitate the sickness portion of life. So that's estate planning in a nutshell.
I love that.
That's
Now, I
great.
think the second part of your question was why is it important? Well, that could be the whole show, really.
Right.
So I guess the briefest answer to that is without I guess biblically they say without a plan the people will perish. And so that's exactly why. If we don't have a plan in place, what I have seen and what in my experience is the fighting and the loss of assets because there is no plan. So it's important to do estate planning so that things can transfer seamlessly from one person or one generation to the next one.
Yep.
I was gonna say I think it's really interesting to hear you say the second part of estate planning, as far as like your health directive and stuff of that nature, because I think that's a big part that people don't think about, especially individuals who don't have children. Because normally most people assume like, oh, my
Mm-hmm.
kids will take care of me and stuff of that nature. But we have a
Mm-hmm.
generation of people that there's a lot more people that are opting to not have children. So it's even more important that they have those things in place so that if that day does come and they do need that help, it's already in writing what's going to occur. Because like I said, I experienced there was nothing in place written wise when my grandfather passed away. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, but thankfully my mom stepped up, and then luckily there was enough money because we didn't know beforehand. But luckily there was enough money where he could go into a really nice facility, not a Medicaid facility, But it is, like you said, it's very important to have those things written out and plan wise prior to even needing to use them.
Absolutely.
Well, and one
So a
thing,
lot of times people go ahead.
well, I was going to say a lot of times what Brandon says is sometimes if somebody dies, it's actually easier to manage that than when somebody has become disabled or permanently ill or is fighting, and progressing through dementia and Alzheimer's, because then you're left with the kind of the shell of the person, if you will. I know that sounds terrible, but that's the reality. And then you're also strapped with the burden of their care and the cost of that care. And so sometimes that is more detrimental on a family, especially when there isn't a plan in place, as compared to death and now they're gone.
No, absolutely. We've seen families really fall apart under just caregiving, the stress of caregiving, the expense of caregiving. I don't think people, again, we don't think about this stuff, so we haven't looked into it. We don't know what it costs to put somebody in a nursing home. Unfortunately, it's part of my practice. And so here in Georgia, the average nursing home is 7,500 to 10,000 a month. Most Americans did not save enough to be able to cover that cost. And what they did save, their intention was to pass that to the next generation. They didn't bookmark that money to say, oh, that's going to be for my nursing home care. And so there's a whole thought process like, well, I really worked really hard to give my kids a leg up or to give my grandkids, something to be able to move the needle for them. Never in my wildest dreams did I think, oh, wait, I'm going to have to deplete all of that just because we're living longer. I might have to go into this type of facility. And so that's where estate planning can also really be helpful, because there are things and tools that we can do under estate planning that gives you the ability to still pass assets to family members, but look at government assistance like Medicaid as another option for paying for a nursing home or long-term care facility. So it gives you kind of the best of both. So you can still keep some assets, pass them as you intended, but still be able to maybe get some benefits from the government to pay for that care.
And I can, like I said, unfortunately, I've seen too many times of nursing home in my family. For most people, if you saw what a Medicaid facility looks like, you don't want that option if you don't have to.
Well, see, I challenge you on that. I would challenge you on that
I don't want the ones
because
in North Carolina
most
and South
facilities,
Carolina.
as I was going to say, it might be just region specific, but most facilities, even some of the nicer ones, they have to have Medicaid beds available.
Okay.
That's how they get their funding. And so you may not know that a very nice facility has a few beds that are earmarked for somebody that is getting Medicaid. And by law, they're not supposed to treat those people any differently.
Okay.
So you can, and some
That's good to
times
know.
part of planning is being real strategic. And so we
Mhm.
might private pay for a few months, knowing that money's gonna run out, and we might need to kick in that Medicaid, but we already here, so.
I love that. But again, working with a professional
like
who
I said, I
knows
learned
those
something new.
things. Yeah, working with a professional who knows those things and knows how to navigate that system, that is, I mean, priceless, So I think that's a great call out. I want to talk about what you said at the very beginning when it comes to the stuff, right? The actual, what do you own, your home and your car and land and things like that. What happens when there's nothing in place and you pass away? Because we hear the
Okay.
term probate all the time, and I don't know if that is
Mhm.
what happens here, but can you tell us what happens to your assets when you pass away and you don't have proper estate planning documentation in place?
Okay, so full disclosure, my practice is in Georgia, so I can speak only under Georgia law. You guys, I know, are in North Carolina, but
Yes.
very general. When you pass away and there's no plan in place, or you don't have a trust in place, because even if you do have a will, we're going to have to go through probate court. So, probate court is, I just tell people, it's the process of getting stuff out of dead people's name to living people. That's the its
I love that.
purpose. Is figuring out who are your heirs, who are the people that are entitled to your stuff after you have passed away. So let's say you had a house, you had some vehicles, and you had some bank accounts. You have no plan in place, those bank accounts will be frozen because the bank doesn't know who should get the funds that are in there. And so we have to then go to probate court and say, hey, judge, we need to put somebody in place to be able to access those funds, sell that property if need be, or distribute it to whoever the next heir is. Now, whether that person died with a will or without a will kind of dictates a little bit about how things will flow. If the person had no will, then we have to look for whatever heirs they may have. So that is a perfect and ripe opportunity for people to step up and say, hey, he was my daddy too, or I'm her love child that you may not have known about. And so all of that has to be addressed. We have to go through all of that in probate court. I had a case recently, they thought it was just 3 children. It's actually 8. That was quite a
Ooh.
surprise.
Wow. Not just
Yes.
one extra one.
So
Ooh.
so you also think about your legacy and what you're trying to leave and how that feels for your kids to discover all these other kids, and like it can be so messy, guys.
Mm.
So once we have to do potential DNA testing. We may have to exhume that body to get a sample to be able to test those people. Yeah, it gets really, really deep. Once we figure out who all the heirs are, then we got to get everything handled with creditors. So, this is what people don't understand. When you die, your creditors don't just go away. Everybody's like, I'm taking it to the grave. Nah, don't go that way.
Mm.
So, under Georgia law, we have to publish for your creditors. And most credit card loans, all of them, they have a whole department whose job it is to read the obituaries and to read the paper to see who done died and owe them money.
Ooh.
And so they
Oh my
can then
gosh.
file a claim and say, hey, she died. This is Amex. She owed me $10,000. And so those bank accounts that were frozen, now those funds need to either be used to settle with Amex, or if you left money debt to the IRS, we have to pay the IRS. We have to pay any last funeral expenses or medical expenses that you may have had. If you had any attorney fees, those need to be taken care of, and then what's left will be
Mm.
distributed among those children. So sometimes there's nothing left.
So
Or maybe you didn't have any bank accounts. Maybe all you left was that house and that vehicle, and IRS and Amex and everybody say we're going to need to force the sale of that because we need our money.
so the question I think
Wow.
people may have in their minds is, in the event of you passing, well, granted, I take it back. If you pass young unexpectedly, and you had student loans, what
Oh.
happens with those?
Now, student loans are a little different. Now, those most are forgiven when you pass, especially if they're federal loans. Those are definitely going to go. Some of the private lenders I've seen, they still try. They at least gonna file a claim and let the judge tell them they're not
Mm.
entitled to the money.
So what you just described, the thing that always sticks out to me about probate is how long it takes from start to finish. But what you just described, the DNA testing, finding all the heirs, uncovering what are the assets and all of that. I mean, that takes a long time, I'm assuming. What I
Yeah,
mean,
it
what's
does.
The court's not known for
So
being
I will
fast.
tell you now, post COVID, we're back to kind of normal in the probate world. But even the best streamlined case where we know that it's only one heir and we know all the assets, that still could be anywhere from 8 months to a year. And then here's what people don't think about. What if that house had a mortgage?
I was
Who's paying
thinking
it
that.
for 8 months to a year?
Mm,
And so
exactly.
what we see a lot of times is the largest asset in that estate gets lost before we can even finish probating the estate because the mortgage company is not in there. They don't care that you have died. They don't care that this is being sorted out
Oh,
in probate court. They want their money. This house was put up as collateral, and so if it is not a payment, it reverts back to them. And so a lot of people end up losing the home while we're trying to sort this all out.
that's
That is the
devastating.
number one thing when I sit down with someone and they own property, own a home, and they don't have a will or anything established. I'm like, they're like, oh, well, if I pass away, so-and-so would get this. I'm like, you need to have this in writing and also have a way to fund it. Because if you don't have it in writing, as you said before, it could take a long time. And then that person, if they want to keep the asset, they're going to have to pay for it. So it's like, you really didn't give them an asset. You actually kind of added
A
another liability
liability.
You added a debt.
to their,
You
to their,
absolutely added a debt.
Yeah.
Because if they already have a home, they're paying their own mortgage and they're going to pay your mortgage for 8 months to a year before they even know if the house is going to finally come to them. Most people are not willing to sign up for that.
yeah.
Right.
And especially if you have multiple siblings and they're all in dispute, I'm not paying. So sometimes you'll see nobody wants to pay the mortgage because they don't know if the house is actually coming to them, or they don't want to pay the property taxes. Property
Mm-hmm.
taxes also come due. And so
Yep.
we have seen families time and time again lose the properties just because they're still fighting. We have not gotten through the DNA testing. We have not gotten through the hard feelings to even start to deal with the assets.
And
Wow.
not to get too deep, when you have multiple siblings, that doesn't even get into the weeds where if you have a piece of land and it's divvied up between 5 individuals and maybe one individual wants to sell and what that causes.
Listen, don't get me started. I
She
even when
literally
we
went
do
through that.
estate planning and we see it all the time. Mom comes in, she's like, "Well, I got 5 kids. I can't treat one better than the others. Give it to all 5." And I'm trying to explain to her how this is going to be a logistical nightmare once you are gone. Because one's gonna want to sell it, one wants to live on it, one wants to make it an Airbnb, and nobody wants to pay.
Mm.
What do we
Wow.
do then? And so they can force sales. And so what would
Hmm.
have been an asset that maybe we could have rented out, get some passive income up, now we have to sell it.
Oh,
Now it's gone.
and there are
Now the
people
benefit we would have gotten is gone.
there are people
Right.
who look for those
Oh
specific
yeah.
situations and they go and target one individual. And they're like, they
Yep,
force the sale, which allows them
absolutely.
to actually end up buying everything.
Right. And then
Yep.
that's how we lose
Yep. We get
generational wealth and assets and all the things.
back to when there's no plan. That's how we perish because you have the one holdout that's like, I just want my money. I just want my money. And then you have this investor that comes in quietly and is just like, hey, if y'all sell that, this is what you would get. And now that person's pushing everybody to sell. They're not doing the research. They're not looking at the market. They're not understanding like what we could do with this property down the road. And so now everybody's just frustrated and hard feelings and they just sell. And then I tell people that's when the Starbucks moves in.
Yes. I do have a question. You said at the beginning, if there's not a plan in place, everything gets frozen. What happens to those accounts that do have a beneficiary attached, but if there is no will or no trust? What happens to my 401k? I have a named beneficiary, but I have nothing else in place. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So bank accounts, life insurance, 401ks, you can do a beneficiary or you can designate who it will be paid to on death or transferred to on death. So whoever you have placed on those documents, it goes directly to those people. So your 401k, for example, that's a contractual relationship. You put your money in, you decide where it goes from there. So those stay out of your probate estate. Those just pass based on whatever you've put on there. Same thing with the life insurance. You pay the premium, in exchange they will pay these people after you have passed away. A lot of times people don't put somebody's name on there, or they put somebody who's already predeceased them. And so now it's like, okay, well, where does the money go if that is the case? And that, or my favorite, you haven't looked at those forms since you got that job 20 years ago. And you put your first wife and you on wife number 3.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you pass and wife number 3 is calling my office because she don't understand why wife number 1 got all the money, because we have to look at these things regularly. This is part of planning, is making sure this is consistent with where you are in life and where your wishes are. So while those things pass outside of probate, you want to make sure it's going to the right people.
Yes.
I do yearly
Mm-hmm.
beneficiary updates to make sure that nothing's changed, no relationships, no hard feelings or whatever, where you want to change actual beneficiaries. I do that because unfortunately I did have a scenario where I did not put the life insurance in place. I was simply the individual who had to deliver the death benefit, and it was
Mm.
not to his current wife because he had his
Mm-hmm.
ex-wife on there and did not update it. and that was not a fun conversation.
And it was more than $1 million,
no, it
right?
wasn't. No, it was 600,000.
Oh, okay.
I mean, still a substantial amount of money that
That
someone
was
thought
Still
they
a
were
lot of
receiving.
money.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I was like, there's nothing like because the actual second wife who thought it was coming to her called in and asked about it, and I was
Yeah.
like, you're not the beneficiary, so I can't even give you any information. And they were like, what? I was like,
She called your office, then she probably called my office thinking she could do something
this
legally.
is it.
And no.
And that's and I love that you point out because like once you pass away and that paperwork is how it is, I don't think there's nothing you can do about it.
No, no. I mean, there are challenges to the paperwork if there's some belief that maybe that person was coerced into putting that person on there. But those are usually when you see somebody on their deathbed changing
Right.
forms and all this other stuff. Then there might be an argument. But he filled that form out 20 years ago. There's no challenge here. He knew what he was doing then. He should have changed it if he wanted it to be something different.
Yeah.
So the one thing I want to make sure that our listeners really understand and hopefully start to enact and do some actual actions is for a regular person, what is the most basic estate planning that should be done for most people?
For almost everybody, I say if you don't do anything else, do your power of attorney and do your advanced healthcare directive. Your power of attorney is probably the most powerful of all of your estate documents because we don't know when we're going to have a stroke. We don't know when we're going to have a heart attack. We don't know when we're going to have dementia. And when the people that you love don't have the authority and the power to do anything for you, that's when things just kind of go amok. And so the power of attorney allows someone to step in your shoes and really take over paying the mortgage, going to the banks, making sure that if a lawsuit needs to be brought on your behalf, then they can stand in as you in that lawsuit. They can file your taxes. They literally step in your shoes and do all the things that you're currently doing with your finances. So the power of attorney is for that purpose. And then the advanced healthcare directive, because you want to designate who has a say in your healthcare decision making. If you could not speak for yourself, who is the person that's going to advocate for you, who's going to say, no, we need a second opinion. No, we need to leave this hospital. They're not giving you the quality of care that you need. And then if the doctors are saying, listen, there is no likelihood they're going to recover. What do you want us to do? We've done all we know how to do medically. Who makes that final decision about it's time to either let natural death occur or it's time to continue to fight and go elsewhere? And what happens is you have 5 kids. Everybody want to be in charge. And they all feel differently about whether mama should continue, on this respirator or it's time to let her go. So we need one person that's going to be that point person. And mom needs to designate who that's going to be.
But just to be clear,
So those are my 2.
it doesn't need to be a child, right? Like if
Oh, no.
right, like if
It shouldn't be a minor.
my 5 children are too emotionally invested because they're my children to think clearly in a situation like that, I should designate somebody who can be clear-minded and firm in their decision making, understand my wishes in whatever the situation is, and it doesn't have to be a family member or a child or a sibling, right? It could be anybody who you think is going to make the best decisions based on your wishes in those moments, right?
Absolutely. So a lot of times clients name best friend, deacon at the church, whoever they know is going to advocate for them.
Yeah, that's good.
So one of the things you also hear so much on social media is about trust. Have a trust for this, have a trust for that. Can you break down maybe like the basic idea that let's just use us as the example, I'm 41, she's 39, we have 2 kids, own a home. Do we need a trust? And if so, what type of trust would you think would be best?
All right. So do you need a trust? I would say yes, because you have those minor kids. If you didn't have minor kids, my answer might be a little bit different. What I love about a trust is if something were to happen to both of you today and those minor kids are still minors, we now have a plan for all of those assets, whether they're going to be held in trust till those kids get to a different age, whether we've given the trustee the discretion to use those funds for their health, education, and maintenance until they get to the age of majority. So it gives you a lot of control over what will happen to your assets in response to those minor kids and getting them to the age of majority. A will doesn't really do that. The will just says, here's my stuff, who it goes to when I'm dead. You can, in theory, put a trust in a will, but then that has to be overseen by the probate court. And we don't like that because then there's fees involved and there's always got to get court permission. So the trust that you set up now while you're still alive for your minor kids give you maximum control over how everything is going to be distributed. Now, as far as what type of trust, because yeah, TikTok has everybody in these streets calling me about a trust. I had a lady come in literally last week who was just like, my grandbaby says I need a trust because she saw it on TikTok. And I was like, okay.
Oh my gosh.
Now, there are all types of trust. There is, generation skipping trust. There is but the two main categories of trust are revocable trust and irrevocable trust. And then within those categories, there are different types. Most common is a revocable trust. And that just simply means that you two, Jessica and Brandon, are the creators of the trust, but you are also the first managers of that trust. So you're your first trustees. And anything you put in, you still have retained the right to be able to take out, to change how you want to make those distributions. So you can take things out, put things in, and amend that trust as often as your heart desires. Now, after you pass away, typically after the first death, when I have couples, it becomes irrevocable. And that's the second category. Those are the trusts that don't change. Those are the ones that we're not moving things in and out of. Think of it as, I say, trusts are like treasure chests. We're just dumping the assets in there. We're dumping the house in there. We're dumping the cars in there, the bank accounts in there. I draft a manual to all the things that's in there, when they can come out and who they go to. With the irrevocable trust, we're dumping everything in there, but we're putting a padlock on that treasure chest. That's the difference.
Your analogies are just incredible because I literally have the visual and I'm like, ooh, padlock. Ooh, I can open this. They're fantastic. I just needed to call that out.
Well,
That
thank you, because I do a lot of presentations in the African American community, because
is so
this is
good.
foreign to us. We haven't benefited from trust. Other communities, they've been doing this. Our communities are just starting to have these conversations, and so it's
So
important for me to be able to make this as plain as possible for people to understand like how these things work. So
you're doing a
thank you.
great job. No, that's perfect. I think that leads me to one point that I think we definitely want to get into with the time that we have left, which is our children. You're a parent, we're parents. I would say most of our listeners are probably parents. And so the assumption, I think, is, oh, if something happens, like Brandon and I travel a lot, we don't do the thing where it's like, you take this plane ride, we're traveling together. So if the plane's going down, we're gone. Okay. If we didn't have our will and our trust and our guardianship in place, what happens to the children? Because I think the assumption is, oh, my mom gets the kids, or my brother gets the kids, or somebody in the family gets the kids, and it'll be okay. Talk to us about what actually happens if you don't have proper planning in place for the guardianship of your children should something happen.
That's a great question. So you're right. The presumption is some family member is going to get the kids. And it's actually happened in my community. The husband and wife died on vacation. So think about, let's say you guys got in a car accident, date night. Those kids are with the babysitter and you didn't come home. Well, that 18-year-old babysitter is going to call 911 because they don't know what else to do. And then DFACS is going to get involved. And that's where people don't realize, like, DFACS, that's their job, to come in and say, okay, where are these parents? So those kids might end up in foster care before they eventually get to some family members. And then
Wow.
it's which family members, okay? Brandon has his, siblings and his parents. You have your sibling and your parents. Who's the right one? You have a certain set of values and beliefs about how you want your children raised. And you might have some family members that you're like, absolutely not. We are not congruent in how we believe children should be brought up. And those might be the very one that gets the children, because at that point it becomes just a traditional custody battle. So your kids might end up in DFACS care until DFACS can then locate family. So it's whether Brandon's side of the family picks up before your side of the family picks up. Then they might go to them temporary, but then your family says, no, I think that she would have wanted these children to go to me. So now they file for custody. So now the judge has to listen to all the testimony. It becomes a trial. It's a custody trial, just like in a divorce or any other type of hearing. And they have to determine and weigh the evidence and figure out which one of these parties are the ones that are best suited for raising these children. And again, the judge does not know either one of you and don't know your family. So they don't know anything outside of what is presented in that courtroom. They don't know what your personal beliefs were about some of these family members.
Now, you and I, before the call, talked about guardianship versus conservatorship. And I think my reference for conservatorship is obviously Britney Spears, right? Because that was the conservatorship situation that I think any millennial knows about. But can you talk to us about the difference between guardianship and conservatorship? And would those be the same people? Can they be different people? What does or should that look like?
Okay. So again, this is real state specific, what they call it. Here in Georgia, we have conservator of the assets. So funds and bank accounts and stuff. And then we have guardianship of the person. So your actual physical body. Can they be the same, one and the same? Yes. Are they often? It just really depends. So let's say, again, we'll use the minor children because we do guardianships and conservatorships for minor children often. The guardianship and who is going to actually be responsible for rearing that child may happen in probate court, that's temporary, or might happen in our higher court, superior court, where now we're looking at permanent. But then who's going to be in charge of any funds that that child may have inherited or may have received as a result of you guys passing? That happens in probate court. And again, the judge decides who is going to be over those funds. Sometimes it's a family member who's petitioned to be over those funds, or sometimes it's somebody that's appointed by the court who is then paid out of those funds that they are managing for that minor child. What I don't love about conservatorships and what people really need to understand is when that child turns 18, everything that's in that conservatorship is handed over to them because by law they are now an adult. So if it's $1 million in that conservatorship, are they going to have it at 18 and a half or 19? And so without a plan, there is no way to control that because that is the law. That is the default. Whereas when you do a trust and you've left those funds to that minor child in trust, you get to control when that child receives those funds. So you can say maybe the first 10,000 at 18, but you're getting some monthly payments or yearly payments over the course of some time because I want to wait till you're more mature and can handle it.
And when you meet with the estate planning attorney and you establish a trust, they can help you as far as writing all that language into the trust, correct?
Yep, that's my job. You don't worry about the language. You just tell me what your wishes are. If you come in and tell me, listen, my child's on drugs, I know that, leaving them a lump sum of money is going to be to their detriment. I will do the drafting of the language, making sure that either they're going to get drug tested before they get any distributions, or maybe they get skipped because of those drugs, or whatever the case may be. I do that piece. You just tell me what the concerns are and what the wish is.
And I have one question for you as far as your viewpoint, because obviously there are things like LegalZoom that I think too many people use. But I want to get your
Anybody not watching on YouTube, she just made
I want to get your take on LegalZoom because I think you and I are the same mindset when it comes to this, but I want to hear what you have to say.
So, and I'm not picking on LegalZoom. There's a bunch of different done for you DIY software. I just call them DIY software out there on the internet. You can download, print these little PDFs, or you can buy a little will kit at Office Depot. All of those.
I have seen those, yeah.
You, yes, you get what you pay for. Listen, it baffles me that you've spent whatever 500,000 on this house. You've got insurance for this house. You've done all the things, but you've never taken the next step to make sure you know what's going to happen to that house. Like if the house burned down, you got insurance. You know exactly what's going to happen. You're going to get a check. But you've never taken the next step and you're not willing to make the investment to make sure that it's done properly. So I've seen documents from some of these DIYs, and the second part of my practice is probate. We go to probate court quite a bit. We make a lot of money off of those documents because they're wrong. They're always wrong. And if you look at the fine print on all of those websites, they will tell you go consult an attorney because it's not what you think it is. We've seen people leave everything to the cat. We
Oh,
had one, I'll tell you this story because I have tons of them, but we had this one woman who owned a lot of property. She had done a will previously, but needed to revoke that will. She fell out with the people she had left everything to. She asked her grandson for help. Him and his sister would have been her only heirs. Grandson decided to be cheap, went online, got one of these DIYs. Like, it's fine, grandma, just fill this out. We spent what, 2.5 years in litigation?
oh my gosh.
So he paid what, $80 online. He paid 50,000 when we were done with court.
And
So
all
you
that
get
wasted
what you pay
time.
for.
I
Yeah.
also tell people with
Yeah.
that software, it spits out what you put in. So if
And
you
if
don't
you
know
don't
what you're
know,
putting
yeah.
in,
Right.
you don't know like you might have thought that you put in the right information, but you're putting in the wrong information. And technically, what they spit out for you is correct, but you put in the wrong info.
That's terrible.
Exactly. So it can be very expensive. I tell people cheap is expensive. Like it can on
Oh,
the
that's
back
so
end, you might
good.
be saving a few bucks,
That's
but
so
you're
good.
going to leave such a nightmare for your children to fight about, and years of court and hurt feelings, and this is your legacy. This is the last memory that they're going to have of you.
And you
Hmm.
really only get
So
one
when your
time to
name
do it
comes
right.
up in
Yeah.
conversation, huh?
You only get one time to do it right. So
Yeah. So when your name comes up in conversation, it's not going to be those warm memories of, oh, it was so lovely, going to grandma's house. It's like, do you know how much we have been fighting ever since grandma died?
Hmm. Yeah, why would you want that? I do just quickly want
Yeah.
to go back to the children and the guardianship and conservatorship. What do people need to do to avoid exactly what you just described? Like, I could not imagine our children going, the example you gave of like the babysitter's here, we're on a date night, we get in a terrible accident and we don't come home, and our children going into foster care, right? Especially, we've got two grandmas right up the road. I cannot fathom that thought. How do we avoid that from happening? What do we need to put into place?
So, first off, you need to train your babysitters. Do not call 911 first. Call grandma. Call those
Always
people and
smart.
have them come over, and then we call 911. You also want to put in place, in Georgia, we can do what's called a standby guardianship. So, we literally put together paper that says, here is kind of temporarily who would be the guardian of our children in the event something were to happen to us. So, you want to call that guardian first. Call that guardian, they come over, they have their paperwork, like, look, they've already named me. So then when defects in 911 shows up, then they're like, oh, they already dealt with that. Great. Well, you're here now. Let's get, everything in place. Then, if need be, they can file for permanent guardianship. The court is going to give great weight to the fact that this is the person you selected when you
Yes.
did that temporary guardianship. So that is very likely who is going to end up with those children. That's how you prevent that. Then, if let's say you did pass away, let's say that horrible accident, you both passed, in your will, you can also name who would be your guardians for minor children. And so, if you named the same person that you named as the temporary, then they will likely stay in that role. But you can name somebody that's temporary, grandma that's up the street. just for emergency type situations, and then permanently who's going to raise them to majority might be somebody totally different.
Okay, that's a great call out.
Yeah, it's a really good call out.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we could talk to you for hours because I know that there's so much more that we.
Oh, we just scratched the surface.
I know, we're like barely there. We need to have part 2, part 3, part 4 of this conversation. This has been so, so wonderful. We want to leave our listeners with like a final thought. I know that there's so much that we want them to take action on if they haven't already, and to speak with an attorney within their state, and to ask the questions, draft the right paperwork. Don't take the cheap 1999 Office Depot, paperwork route. Like, actually go and meet with an attorney. What would you leave our listeners with as a final thought or call to action today?
So people always ask me, well, what's the first step? Because they hear me speak and then they're like super overwhelmed and don't know where to go from there. First, organize your assets. Know what you own. If you think somebody else gonna be able to find them, like, no. So get everything organized, and then go speak to an attorney and say, okay, here's what I have, here's what I own, here's what I'm thinking. But organization is a huge part of this, because when that person dies and now everybody turns into detectives, because we got to figure out who you had life insurance with, who was your 401k with, and we don't live at home with our parents anymore, so we don't know what they have. We don't know who they bank with. Or you'd be surprised, even within spouses. I've had situations where spouses are like, I don't know who our mortgage company is. So get as organized as you can, with the assumption that somebody else is going to have to look and deal with this. So take yourself out of this and say, okay, if somebody else had to do this, would they know where my bank accounts are? Would they know where my life insurance is? Would they know that I own this little plot of land that I never developed? So get all of that organized, and then go see an attorney. Stop being cheap.
I love it.
That's it.
Just like you said, being cheap is expensive.
I love that. We just did an episode on, we called it our When I Die Guide, and it's a 17-page document that we created. And it's literally exactly that. It's an organization document to help you get organized on what you have, where are your accounts, who are your beneficiaries, what are the account numbers, what do you own, and even down to what kind of funeral do you want to have? What do those wishes look like? Do you want to have it at the church? Do you want to have it at the park? Do you what do you want your scriptures to be? What do you want the music to be? I mean, all of that is so in line with what you just said, because it sounds like, just like we've talked about, when there isn't a plan in place, when people don't know what even exists, that's when instead of taking the time to grieve like you should, you're digging through documents and you're playing detective and you're spending countless hours, weeks, months, and potentially even longer to even just get things sorted out before you can even have a resolve. So what you just said is totally in line with what we've been, kind of preaching as well, and trying to help people with, just from a surface, non-legal level. So thank you for confirming that we're on the right track.
Yeah, but so one of the things I always do is I have a running Google Doc for us and for my clients, as far as all the important information of where things are located at and stuff of that nature, and just periodically updating those. But then also, for example, like having, I always make sure that if something were to happen to you, who would be the individual that would take care of your kids? Who is the individual that would handle your estate? Because I need to know their name and they need to know my name, so that, in the event that does happen, they have somebody else that can help them out with all that stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I'll say with that Google Doc, just make sure somebody else know how to get to it, because I've had to get plenty of court orders to get into computers, because family members are like, I know it's on their computer. Like, we live in such a digital age right now. Yes.
I told them, like, we create the Google Doc, you have it, now you need to share it with the person who would be in charge of it.
Yeah.
Yes, because we end up unfortunately seeing so many people like, I know she lived on this computer. Everything is in there, but I have no idea how to get in there. So it's almost like, what was the point in her doing it? So yes, share it.
Absolutely. Nicola, for anybody in Georgia specifically, right, that wants to get in touch with you, work with you, get their life organized, get their estate plan together, where can they find you? How should they reach out?
Sure. The easiest is pick up the phone, like we old school. Just call the office. Can I share the number?
Yeah, of course. And we'll put it all in the show notes as well. Yeah, of course.
Okay, perfect. So you can call our office at 404-410-6505. We are all on almost all social media platforms, so just Google SR Law. We have a podcast, so you can always, if you want to hear
We'll link
more
that
of
too.
me, explaining this, you can always hop on there as well.
Yeah. Well, you have been a wealth of knowledge. Thank you for helping us scratch the surface. Let's be very clear. There's so much more to estate planning than what we covered in this hour, but this has been so fantastic. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. We're so grateful to have you on the Sugar Daddy podcast today.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.
Sugar Daddy Podcast, yo. Learn how to make them pockets grow. Financial freedom's where we go.